Hey everybody, we are in our catch-up mode today for a couple of notes that we missed. So if you could just follow this video to the end, that would be fantastic. Don't forget to make a note card for all your notes, and we will take our test on Wednesday. Tomorrow you'll have the opportunity to work on Everfi or play Kahoot. And I think there'll be one other item posted on Canvas that you can take a look at. It's going to be called Locked Away Forever. You'll also have the opportunity to do that. All right, here we go. Notes on juvenile legal issues. Thing that finally pertains to you guys. So here we see juvenile. So juvenile court systems are going to treat youth offenders very differently. And so you may have already in your mind some ideas about how those things work. We're going to look at them today. A juvenile, by definition, is somebody who is considered underage. Now, we've already talked about in class that the majority of juveniles, for juveniles in the majority of states, that is under the age of 18. Okay. However, North Carolina is the last to change that law, and so grandfathered in are some 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds that are already considered adults, but in a little less than 2 years, it'll be moved all the way up to 18, so it'll be right on par with the rest of the country. Juvenile delinquency is the terminology for youths who have broken the law, and a juvenile delinquent is a person who has done that. So the question to the court and to our law, to our legal system is, should youth offenders be treated differently than adults? The goal of the juvenile court is to provide treatment, resources. The idea is to catch criminal behavior and correct the behavior to develop productive citizens. Cases not only deal with delinquency, but also neglect through parents. Sometimes there's abuse, and juvenile courts sometimes branch and merge into family courts. Cases oftentimes, when there's a crime, will be taken care of in juvenile court, but if things are identified or if the problems at home are found out in court, that can sometimes lead to legal action or local government and people stepping in to help the juvenile with their home situation. Teen court, first-time offenders can be judged by peers, and this is a teen court application I will leave for you guys on Canvas. If you find this to be interesting, you can apply to work through and work in teen court, which is a really interesting concept. And first-time offenders can sometimes be judged by and go through the procedures of court through their peers. Juvenile arrest is handled differently. Parents have to be notified, and usually the juvenile is released to their parents, and then the court date is set. There are some times, though, where you'll see number 2 does not happen, and that will depend on a couple of different factors. 1, the crime. 2, the age of the juvenile. If the juvenile is approaching 18 in the majority of states, or in North Carolina if it was approaching 16 years past, then depending on the crime, sometimes the juvenile was not released to parents. Sometimes they were locked up. Juvenile court is a private courtroom setting. There is no jury. It's more of a hearing than it is a trial. Attorneys are sometimes used. And the last thing that's not on my list here that I wanted to mention is that the identity of the juvenile is protected. So in cases that we know that have gone on to become memorable events with a juvenile, like Roe v. Wade, the protected identity of that person, that was a protection of Roe, of Jane Roe. And we've seen this oftentimes in the past when we had actually come into play with other abortion cases, when we had recent immigrants who were here in the United States, and there were cases about whether they could get an abortion when the group that was advocating for their citizenship was not in favor of the abortion. So I think it was a Christian church group, took the recent immigrant, the girl, in, and then it turns out she's pregnant, and so her name is protected because she's juvenile. Also, any footage or any time that you will hear about a case, they'll protect the name, and they'll either blur out the face or not show the face of the juvenile to protect their identity. Juvenile protections, that's what I was just saying. Identity is secret and private. Usually they get lighter punishments. Juvenile records are also sealed at the age of 18. Punishments. Well, you're seeing it right there. Oftentimes, juvenile punishments, because they're looking for the corrective action in the behavior, counseling, foster care, sometimes coming into play, the change of the home atmosphere, juvenile corrections facilities are used, institutional placement, probation, but the number one that we see for juvenile punishment is community service. Again, the idea is to correct the behavior and engage the juvenile in understanding their role in society and making a more beneficial community. Okay, that was it for juveniles. I'm gonna back out just a little bit and push back to trial procedures and the process for our trials, just in case you didn't get these notes. First, the jury is selected. Then the prosecution presents its evidence. There's cross-examination. Then the defense produces their case. There are closing statements. The jury get their instructions. They receive their instructions. And this was all the day that we did the Annenberg Classroom videos. If you were not here for the jury procedures, I have a couple slides more on juries. Otherwise, you can skip ahead to crime rate. Okay, so the jury is given the instructions by the judge. They elect a foreperson. They must make a unanimous decision. And a hung jury is what we call when a group of the jury can't make a unanimous decision, and then there is a mistrial. The court is adversarial in nature. Both the prosecution and the defense act independently. They are going against, remember, adversaries go against, allies are friends together. Prosecution tries to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. The defendant is presumed innocent and attempts to maintain, but does not have to prove innocence, okay? Presumption of innocence, and I'll talk more about that in a second. You'll see a visual that'll help the reasonable doubt and the presumed innocence. Both present their case, the prosecution and the defense, before a neutral jury, and we talked before about how the jury is selected, and we try to, the prosecution and the defense attorneys will try to find the most neutral jurors. The most effective adversary is able to convince the jury that their case is correct. Okay, so that's the prosecution versus defense. So here's that visual that really helps, I think, in understanding where you get to guilty. So we have these levels of proof. So if you start at the bottom and you see no evidence, now I've just blurred it out, that's not what I wanted to do. But you'll see no evidence at the bottom, obviously it's going to be not guilty. Then we move up to what's often used, reasonable suspicion. Okay, this says that it should not be based on specific or particular facts. That should be based on specific facts. Should not be based on a hunch or a guess. Then you have probable cause. Now, you'll see these levels of proof and sound familiar because we talked about these when we covered NJ versus TLO and the Fourth Amendment with regard to whether police officers are able to search your property. And they need probable cause. That's defined as reasonable and trustworthy information that the person has committed that crime. When we talked about NJ versus TLO, probable cause had to include that there were multiple sources who specifically cited who it was that was smoking in the bathroom. They couldn't just go up to the vice principal and say someone was smoking in the bathroom. It had to be clear, okay? So it has to be reasonable and trustworthy. Preponderance is a greater weight, or the amount of evidence clear and convincing is a firm belief, but it has to be beyond that reasonable doubt, okay? And that's how we get to the level of guilt. These are levels of proof. That's how we get to guilty. All right, criminal procedure review. This is if you looked through the arrest video and you made your, with your group, you made your arrest video. So I just wanted to clarify so everybody has the accurate sequence of events here. First, we have an arrest. This is the police arrest, and they book a suspect. Then they go to preliminary hearing. Suspect appears before a judge. Bail is set. Remember that bail is the money you put down as a promise that you will return to jail. If you do not return, the court will keep that money. If you do return, you get that money back. It's a holding fee. An indictment is made by a grand jury or judge, and they hear the evidence and they formally charge the suspect. Then you are arraigned. If you plead guilty, you accept accept the plea bargain, whatever it was that you had decided on earlier, then you see that the flow chart ends. If you do not plead guilty, then the trial date is set. Then we go to trial. The prosecution, the defense present their cases to the judge or jury. The judge or jury will reach a verdict, and either you were acquitted, that means the defendant goes free, you were found not guilty, or you go to sentencing. That means if you were found guilty, there is a sentencing, and the judge sentences the defendant. Please check this against your arrest procedure. We put the slides in order. Please check that and see that you have these in the correct order. Okay, moving on to death penalty as a review, wrapping up from what we talked about the other day, the video that we saw about death row. It is also known as capital punishment. Violent crimes, violent criminal acts, usually murder. There are very few other crimes that qualify for the death penalty. Treason and terrorism. You can imagine why those would fall on this list. And we call death row the waiting space, where criminals who have been sentenced to the death penalty await their death day. Arguments in favor of the death penalty include this serves as an example to other would-be criminals to deter them from committing murder or terrorist acts. Again, we talked about punishment the other day with regards to it being a deterrent, or it could be retributive, which means that you're doing it as a revenge, or lastly, now I'm doing this without notes, the last one would be, we have retributive, which is revenge, deterrence, and then restorative. Pull that one out. Restorative, where you are working through community service and hoping to bring the person back into society. If you didn't get those notes on punishment the other day, do make sure that you get those from a friend. To punish the criminal for their act, that's another idea of the death penalty, and to obtain what we said, like that revenge, okay? So retribution on behalf of their victims. It's the eye for an eye concept. So if you killed so-and-so, you took their life, like we saw with Mr. Lopez on death row with the video. The wife of the police officer was looking for retribution, or the law stated that there was revenge or retribution to have for the loss of that police officer. Arguments against say that, well, 139 countries have abolished the death penalty. Since 1972, 130 innocent people have been sentenced to death. Death penalty cases cost more than non-death penalty cases, and almost all death row inmates could not afford their own attorney. So now we get into the fairness of the trial, the questions of whether a better lawyer could have done more for these people that have been convicted. And when you look at this bullet point that says that people couldn't afford their trial, and then you look at 130 innocent people just since 1972 that we could prove with more DNA evidence and better lawyers and technology, we're figuring out that these lives have been lost. The murder rate in states with the death penalty has been 48 to 101% higher than in states without the death penalty. So if the argument is that it deters people from committing homicide, that is a hard argument to make when you see those numbers. When you look at countries around the world, pull that back. Countries around the world that have abolished the death penalty, like I said, 139 countries abolishing the death penalty. Here we see state by state the different countries that are using the death penalty, that have allowed for it, and then the graph here on the right-hand side. Over the years, we see from the early 1900s was the last time they'd seen the firing squad, but you see the use of electrocution up until the 40s and 50s, and then a quick fall off, and then lethal injection, and the number of confirmed death penalties that were used at that time. Lastly, we see on this map the number of death row inmates that are awaiting as of January 2012. Obviously, the number has changed. The pink is the death penalty, and the green is no death penalty in the states that allow it and don't allow for it. So we see some northern states there up by the Great Lakes, all without the death penalty, but the majority of our states allowing, with very high numbers when you compare them to the federal and U.S. military that are awaiting death penalty. And we see the murder rate. You can compare the murder rate to those awaiting the death penalty. I think that is it. Okay, so here we have, this is the last one on crime rate. I think this is only fourth period needs this one, so if you are not fourth period, you can go to the end of the video. It just gives you some tips on note card creation. Otherwise, you can move on to Everfi. All right, fourth period, here's your last thing. Predict, is the crime rate in America going up or down? Describe, and you should write this as your warm-up, describe the actual crime rate based on the graph, which I'll show you in just a second. Why do you think it has decreased? Why do you think most Americans believe the crime rate is always increasing? So when we look at this, you'll see that the crime rate has been decreasing since the early 90s. But most Americans, when we look at it here, most Americans believe that the crime rate is increasing. And with true hard evidence that we see from the 90s, like I said, has been falling quite steadily. There's a little uptick in the 05, 06 year, it seems, here, and then again in maybe 13, but generally a fall off of crime rate. So just answer those questions, make sure that's in your warm-up, and understand that the crime rate has been falling despite what Americans think. And then just make sure you answer those questions. All right, here's some reasons for the crime drop. Incarceration, policing, social programs, demographics. We have a rising age of older folks who can parent those youngsters who often get into criminal activity. Unemployment insurance goes up. Okay, when folks have jobs or have protection for those jobs, they're less likely to go out and steal. And economic recession, people at home, less valuables, a fall off. I would say generally we have an increase in technology. When we have an increase in technology, folks are less likely to get away with the crime, and I think there's a deterrence for it. One of the things that I said in class when I gave this lecture was the year is 2018. You should assume that everything you say and everything you do is being recorded, right? There are folks out there, even if even if you think that you're the only person around, you don't know what security cameras are up. Everybody has in their hand a recording device that you don't know what's being recorded at what time, even if it's not for any nefarious purposes. It's oftentimes, criminals are caught with using technology. So I think these deterrents, we see the dumb criminals on TV all the time, and I think this makes a change for it. That plus focus in education and community development really pushes for the crime drop. Okay, y'all, that's the last one. Here are your note card tips. Make sure you get those vocab words on there. You get the 3x5. Don't try to change it. When I come in on Wednesday, I'm going to check. If you have anything extra on your note cards on the back side, I will not let you use any of the note card. You can't erase it. So make sure that you only have your notes on one side, and like I said, that it is the proper size. I don't have any extras, so please don't ask the sub for any, but you can make that note card and bring it in, and I will see you Wednesday for our test. Study hard, y'all.